It all began on a humid spring morning in Savannah, Georgia. The sun hung low, casting a golden haze over the narrow streets lined with oak trees dripping in Spanish moss. As I stood outside the colonial-style White House, the weight of the morning's heat mixed with nerves making my scarf cling uncomfortably to my neck. This was my first job in America, worlds away from the bustling market stalls of Tangier, Morocco, where I had spent most of my life. I never thought I'd leave my family or the world I had known for 30 years, but fate often unfolds in ways we can't predict. The Bennetts, a well-to-do family of 4, needed a nanny, and I needed a fresh start. The job wasn't just about earning a paycheck, it was about proving to myself and to my family that I could thrive here. I was 30, single, and determined to build a life of my own. Charlotte Bennett, the mother, was sophisticated and graceful, with an aura that seemed to exude control. She greeted me that day wearing a crisp navy blouse and beige slacks, her dark hair tied back in a sleek ponytail. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were sharp, as if she were constantly assessing everything around her. Then there was her husband, Daniel Bennett. Tall, with an easy demeanor and a kind laugh, Daniel had sandy brown hair and wore glasses that added to his soft-spoken charm. Their 2 children, Ellie and Jonah, were 7 and 4, spirited, curious, and full of energy. I was nervous, naturally. I had never worked as a nanny before, but Charlotte seemed to take comfort in my experience as the oldest of 5 siblings. "You'll be fine," she said reassuringly. Still, I could sense her perfectionist tendencies as she handed me a binder filled with daily routines, emergency contacts, and even instructions on how she preferred the children's clothes folded. The first few weeks passed without incident. I'd wake before sunrise to make breakfast, pack Ellie's lunch, and then spend the day keeping Jonah entertained. My days were a blur of reading storybooks, building pillow forts, and cleaning up spilled juice. By the time I retreated to my modest room on the top floor at night, I was exhausted but fulfilled. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted. It was a month into the job, and I was kneeling on the kitchen floor, wiping up a mess of orange juice that Jonah had spilled, when I noticed Daniel watching me from across the room. He leaned against the counter, his gaze soft and thoughtful. "You're really good with them," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the kitchen. Startled, I looked up. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Bennett." "Call me Daniel," he replied with a warm smile. I nodded, feeling a flush creep up my neck. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, like he genuinely meant it. Back home, men rarely spoke to women with such kindness unless there was an expectation attached. But Daniel seemed different. After that, I began noticing him more. How he'd ask if I'd eaten, how he offered to carry the groceries without hesitation, and how he lingered in the kitchen while I cooked. Meanwhile, Charlotte's demanding corporate job often kept her away from home, leaving me alone with the kids and Daniel more frequently. One evening, as I set the table for dinner, Daniel walked in and leaned against the doorway. "Don't you ever get tired?" he asked. "Tired of what?" I replied without looking up. "Of taking care of everyone," he said softly. I shrugged. "It's my job, I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," he murmured. His words stayed with me long after that conversation. In my culture, women were expected to give selflessly, to serve without question. But Daniel's simple acknowledgement of my efforts made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before. I tried to ignore the warmth his presence stirred within me, reminding myself of the boundaries that needed to remain intact. I was a guest in their home, a Muslim woman bound by tradition and faith. Yet, day by day, it became harder to ignore. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Daniel offered to help. As we stood side by side at the sink, our hands occasionally brushed against each other. "You're special," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you know that." I froze, my breath hitching. "Daniel, please." "I'm sorry," he interrupted, stepping back. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." But he had already crossed a line, and so had I. Because deep down, I knew I didn't want him to stop. My heart raced as I tried to reconcile the swirling emotions within me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the life I had left behind, the traditions I had been raised with, and the expectations I had always carried. But here, in this house so far from home, I was beginning to question everything. I didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: nothing would be the same again. There were boundaries I knew I could never cross, no matter how kind or handsome my employer was. But life, as I would soon learn, had its own plans. That summer seemed to stretch endlessly, with long, sweltering days that bled into humid nights. Charlotte's work trips became more frequent, leaving Daniel and me to manage the children on our own. Slowly, the boundaries I had been so determined to keep began to blur. At first, it was innocent. Shared jokes, stolen glances, and casual conversations that lasted a little too long. But deep down, I knew I was treading dangerous waters. I often heard my mother's voice in my head, stern and unwavering. "Layla, remember who you are. This world will tempt you, but you must stay true to yourself." I had always prided myself on my self-control, on my ability to resist the distractions of the modern world. But Daniel was different. He wasn't just temptation. He was kindness, familiarity, and warmth, in a place where I had once felt like a stranger. It was a rainy evening when everything shifted. The children were asleep, and the house was quiet, save for the soft patter of rain against the windows. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Daniel walked in, rolling up his sleeves. "Need some help?" he asked. "No, it's okay, I'm almost done," I replied, but he stayed anyway. We worked in comfortable silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "Do you ever miss home?" he asked softly. "Every day," I admitted. "But I came here for a reason." "You've sacrificed so much," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. I looked at him, surprised. "Why do you say that?" "Because I see it," he said. "The way you put everyone else first. The way you never complain. It's rare." His words caught me off guard. No one had ever spoken to me like that before. Not even back home. I felt a strange mix of gratitude and guilt, as though I was betraying something sacred, just by listening to him. "It's nothing special," I said, brushing off the compliment. "It is to me," he replied, his gaze locking with mine. In that moment, something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A connection, a spark, a silent acknowledgement of something we both felt but didn't dare name. That night I went to bed with a heavy heart, torn between my faith and the feelings that had quietly taken root within me. I prayed for strength, for clarity, and for the courage to stay on the right path. But deep down, I knew my world was on the verge of changing in ways I could never have imagined. I thought I could keep things professional, that whatever fleeting connection I felt with Daniel would pass like a summer storm. But life is rarely that simple. Each day brought new moments, small, seemingly insignificant on the surface, yet each one chipped away at the walls I had built around my heart. Charlotte's absence became routine. She was off to conferences in New York, business meetings in Chicago, or overnight stays at luxury hotels I'd only seen in magazines. Daniel became the constant parent, and I became his partner in the day-to-day chaos of raising Ellie and Jonah. The children adored him. Ellie would climb onto his lap during story time, her tiny hands clutching his shirt as he read aloud in funny voices. Jonah followed him everywhere, mimicking his every move like a loyal shadow. Watching them together, I saw a side of Daniel that was tender and unguarded, and it stirred something in me I couldn't quite name. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, Daniel walked in carrying a cardboard box. "I thought you might like this," he said, setting it down on the coffee table. "Well, but you not die. You should not." "What is it?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. He opened the box to reveal a set of cookbooks. "I noticed you've been trying new recipes lately," he said with a soft smile. "Thought this might inspire you." I stared at the books, touched by the thoughtful gesture. It wasn't just the gift itself. It was the fact that he had noticed, that he paid attention. The moment felt heavier than it should have, and I could feel the walls around my heart weakening further. I thanked him softly, but my mind was spinning. As Daniel lingered in the doorway, his gaze lingering just a second too long, I knew things between us had reached a point where returning to the way things were would no longer be possible. I stared at him, speechless. It wasn't the gift itself, it was the thought behind it. No one had ever noticed the little things I did, let alone acknowledged them with such sincerity. "Thank you," I said softly, the words catching in my throat. "It's nothing," he replied, but the way he looked at me said otherwise. That evening, after the children were tucked into bed, Daniel and I found ourselves back in the kitchen. It had become our quiet ritual, these moments shared after the whirlwind of the day. I was wiping down the counters when his voice broke the silence. "You work too hard, Leela." I looked up, startled. "It's my job." "No," he said, shaking his head gently. "You do more than your job. You care. You love these kids like they're your own." "They're easy to love," I said, trying to deflect. "So are you." The words hung between us, heavy and dangerous, like a thread pulled too tightly. I froze, unsure of what to say or do next. "Daniel," I started, but he interrupted. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I shouldn't have said that." "No, it's okay," I whispered, though I knew it wasn't. The weight of his words pressed down on both of us, suffocating the space we shared. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't easy to love. I was complicated, burdened by expectations, and bound by rules he could never understand. But instead, I said nothing. The days passed in a blur of routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Daniel's presence seemed to fill every corner of the house. His laughter echoed through the walls. His scent lingered long after he left a room, and his voice replayed in my head, weaving through my thoughts when I tried to sleep. I began to notice the smallest details about him. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he hummed under his breath while doing dishes, the way he gently reminded the kids to say please and thank you. He wasn't just kind, he was thoughtful in a way that felt rare, genuine, and precious. One afternoon, as I pushed Ellie on the swing in the backyard, Daniel came out carrying a tray of iced tea. "Thought you might need a break," he said, handing me a glass. "Thank you," I replied, taking it gratefully. We sat on the porch steps, side by side, watching the children play. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of grass and jasmine. For a while, neither of us spoke, and the silence felt comforting. But then, as if something had been weighing on him, Daniel broke the stillness. "Do you ever think about what your life could have been?" he asked suddenly. I glanced at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you had stayed in Tangier, if you hadn't come here." "All the time," I admitted. "But I came here for a reason." "And have you found it?" he asked, his gaze steady and searching. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "In some ways, yes, but in others, it's complicated." He nodded as though he understood. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" "It does," I agreed, my voice barely a whisper. For a moment we sat in silence, the tension between us thick with things left unsaid. I wanted to tell him how much his kindness meant to me, how his presence had become a comfort in a world that often felt lonely and foreign. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by my thoughts. I thought of my family back home, of my mother's gentle prayers and my father's stern reminders. Stay true to your faith. Never forget who you are. I wanted to believe I was still that girl, the one who prayed 5 times a day and wore her scarf with pride. But the truth was, I was changing, and it terrified me. The next morning, I avoided Daniel as much as possible. I busied myself with chores, keeping my head down and my mind focused on tasks that kept me away from him. But by the afternoon, it was impossible to avoid him any longer. He found me in the laundry room, sorting through a pile of clothes. "Layla," he said softly. I didn't look up. "Yes? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I answered quickly, but my voice betrayed me. I knew he didn't believe me. "Please don't shut me out," he said, stepping closer. "I know I crossed a line." "It's not about you," I interrupted, finally looking at him. "It's about me, my beliefs, my faith." He nodded slowly, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't fully understand. "How could he?" "I can't," I began, but the words caught in my throat. "I can't do this." His gaze softened, and after a long pause, he nodded again. "I understand," he said, though a part of me knew he didn't. The silence that followed felt heavier than words could ever be. We stood there, separated by the very things we could never change. And for the first time, I realized how much it would hurt to let go of what we could never have. His expression was filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Leela. I never wanted to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I said quickly, my voice barely steady. "That's the problem." For a moment we stood there, the silence between us speaking the words we couldn't say aloud. Finally he nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of everything left unsaid. "I'll give you space," he said softly. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling. As he left the room, I felt a wave of relief, mixed with an ache I couldn't quite name. I knew I was doing the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier. That night, I prayed harder than I ever had before. I prayed for strength, for guidance, and for the courage to stay true to myself. As I knelt on the floor, tears streaming down my face, I realized something that shook me. I wasn't just fighting temptation. I was fighting a part of myself I didn't recognize. The days after our conversation in the laundry room were tense but manageable. Daniel kept his promise to give me space, and I did everything I could to refocus on my job. I threw myself into taking care of Ellie and Jonah, planning crafts and baking projects that kept us all busy from morning until bedtime. But even as my hands stayed occupied, my mind wandered to him. Daniel remained cordial, almost distant, and I convinced myself that this was the best way forward. We could pretend that nothing had happened, that the words exchanged in the laundry room had been a brief moment of weakness. For a while, it almost worked. Then came the storm. It was a Friday evening just after sunset when the rain began. Thunder rolled in first, rattling the windows and startling Jonah, who clung to my leg as I cleared the dinner table. "Don't worry, Jonah," I said gently, scooping him into my arms. "It's just a little noise. Let's get you ready for bed, okay?" "Okay," he murmured, resting his head against my shoulder. I carried him upstairs, reading his favorite bedtime story while the rain pounded against the windows. By the time both children were asleep, the storm had intensified. The wind howled, and the flickering shadows outside made the house feel eerily quiet, despite the chaos. I headed downstairs, expecting to find Daniel in his usual spot on the couch. Instead, I saw him standing in the kitchen, staring out the window with a glass of wine in his hand. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and the soft kitchen light cast a glow over the sharp lines of his jaw. He looked deep in thought, so much so that I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should interrupt. "You don't drink wine, do you?" he asked, his gaze still fixed on the storm outside, as if he had sensed my presence without needing to look. "No," I replied, stepping into the room. "It's against my faith." He nodded, finally turning to face me. "I figured as much. You're different." I smiled faintly. "Is that a bad thing?" "Not at all," he said softly. "It's refreshing." I busied myself wiping down the counters, trying to ignore the way his words made my heart race. The tension in the room was almost suffocating, and I could feel his gaze lingering on me as I worked. "Layla," he said, after a long pause. "Yes," I replied, not looking up. "Can we talk?" I stopped wiping and turned to face him. "About what?" "About us." he said, his voice low. I shook my head, my pulse quickening. There is no us, Daniel. Then why can't I stop thinking about you? He asked, stepping closer. Daniel, please, I began, but he cut me off. I know it's wrong, he said, his voice trembling. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. I see you every day, taking care of my kids, making this house feel like a home, and His breath hitched as he ran a hand through his hair. I've never met anyone like you. My breath caught in my throat. His words were everything I had tried to ignore, everything I had told myself I didn't want to hear. But hearing them now, spoken aloud, made it impossible to deny the truth of what was happening between us. Daniel, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You're married. You have a family. The air between us was thick with emotion, with everything we knew we couldn't have. He looked at me for a long moment, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within us. I wanted to tell him to leave, to remind him of his responsibilities, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew they applied to me too. I know, he said, his eyes filled with pain, but Charlotte is always gone, always busy, and when she's here, it's like we're strangers. You're the only one who makes me feel. He stopped, as if the weight of his confession was too much to bear. I stood frozen, torn between the part of me that knew this was wrong and the part of me that longed to feel wanted, cherished, and seen. Daniel, I whispered, but it wasn't a plea for him to stop. It was something else entirely, a surrender. He closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was gentle at first, but deepened as we gave in to the emotions we had fought for so long. His hand slid down to my waist, pulling me closer until I melted into him, forgetting everything else. Charlotte, the children, my faith, my family. In that moment, there was only him. We didn't stop at a kiss. As the storm raged outside, we crossed a line we could never uncross. He led me upstairs to his bedroom, his touch igniting a fire within me that I hadn't known existed. I let him undress me, his hands exploring every inch of my body as though I were something sacred. In his arms, I felt beautiful, powerful, and free. It was nothing like I had imagined. Back home, intimacy was rarely discussed, whispered about behind closed doors as something forbidden and secret. But with Daniel, it was different. He was attentive, patient, and passionate, making me feel things I had never believed possible. For the first time in my life, I felt truly desired. When it was over, we lay tangled together, the sound of rain tapping softly against the windows. I knew I should feel guilty, ashamed, even disgusted with myself, but I didn't. Instead, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though I had finally found a missing piece of myself. The next morning, reality hit me like a freight train. As I got the children ready for breakfast, I avoided Daniel's gaze, the weight of what we had done pressing down on me. But when he caught my eye and gave me a small, knowing smile, that same rush of adrenaline from the night before flooded my veins. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, we stole moments whenever we could, a lingering touch as we passed each other in the hallway, whispered conversations in the kitchen after the children were asleep, hurried embraces behind closed doors. Each time I told myself it would be the last, but it never was. Daniel became my addiction, and I was powerless to resist him. He made me forget everything: my faith, my upbringing, the values I had once held so close to my heart. For a while, I let myself believe that we could live in this bubble, a secret world of our own where no one could find us. But deep down, I knew it couldn't last. And when that bubble finally burst, it would leave nothing but devastation in its wake. The weeks that followed blurred together in a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered promises. My days were filled with equal parts ecstasy and dread. We were both careful and reckless, meeting when Charlotte was away, when the children were asleep, or when the house was empty. With each touch, I told myself it was the last, but it wasn't. I felt like I was living two lives. During the day, I was Layla, the devoted nanny who read bedtime stories, cooked meals, and smiled warmly at Ellie and Jonah. But at night, when the world went quiet and the house fell into darkness, I became someone else entirely, someone who belonged to Daniel in ways I had never belonged to anyone before. One evening, after the children were tucked into bed, Daniel found me in the living room folding laundry. His presence was like a spark that ignited something deep inside me, something I couldn't control. As he stepped closer, I could feel the pull between us, just as powerful, just as dangerous as it had been the night of the storm. "Layla," he said softly, and my hand stilled on the pile of clothes. I knew what was about to happen. I knew I should stop it. But as he closed the distance between us, his gaze filled with longing, I realized that once again, I wasn't strong enough to walk away. And once again, I surrendered. Charlotte had left that morning for another work trip, and the house was unusually quiet. Daniel stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room before he even spoke. "Do you ever stop working?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement. I looked up, smiling despite myself. "Someone has to keep this place running." He crossed the room and sat beside me, his thigh brushing lightly against mine. "You're amazing, you know that?" I shook my head, laughing softly. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said, his tone serious now. "You're more than that. You've done more for this family than I think Charlotte or I ever could." A pang of guilt twisted in my chest at the mention of her name. "You shouldn't say that." "Why not?" It's true." I avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the pile of clothes in front of me. "You love her, Daniel. She's your wife." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I do love her, but not the way I should. Not the way I love you." His words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he couldn't love me, that what we were doing was a mistake. But I couldn't because deep down I knew I felt the same way. He reached for my hand, his fingers gently intertwining with mine. "Leela, look at me." Reluctantly, I lifted my eyes to meet his. The intensity in his gaze made my breath hitch. "You mean everything to me," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "I know this isn't right, but I can't imagine my life without you." The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I cried. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." "Neither did I," he replied, his voice gentle. "But I don't regret it." As the weeks turned into months, our affair became harder to hide. Charlotte's frequent absences gave us the freedom to indulge in our forbidden relationship, but the moments when she was home became unbearable. I avoided her as much as I could, ashamed to meet her trusting gaze. She was kind to me, warm, and utterly unaware of the betrayal unfolding under her own roof. "Layla, you've been such a blessing to this family," she said one evening as we sat together in the kitchen. "I don't know how we managed before you came along." Her words felt like a knife to my chest, and I forced a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennet." "Please, call me Charlotte," she said with a laugh. "You're practically part of the family." Her trust only deepened my guilt, but it didn't stop me. Each night after Charlotte went to bed, Daniel would find me. Sometimes we talked, other times we simply held each other, lost in the silence of the sleeping house. More often than not, we ended up in his bed, tangled in a passion that made me forget everything else. One night, after Charlotte had left for a weekend conference, Daniel and I shared a bottle of wine in the living room. I hadn't planned to drink, but he insisted, pouring me a small glass and teasing me until I took a sip. The warmth of the wine spread through me, loosening the tight grip of my self-control. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice slow and husky. "Do you know that?" I shook my head, feeling my cheeks flush. "You're just saying that." "I'm not," he said, leaning closer. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." Before I could respond, he kissed me. His lips captured mine in a way that left no room for doubt. This wasn't just lust. It was something deeper, something neither of us could name. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself surrender completely. We didn't make it to the bedroom that night. Instead, we stayed on the living room floor, the flickering light of the fireplace casting shadows on the walls as we lost ourselves in each other. His touch was tender and urgent, a combination that made me feel both cherished and consumed. In his arms, the outside world melted away. No guilt, no consequences, only the intensity of the moment. But even as I lay there afterward, my head resting on his chest while the fire crackled softly, a familiar unease began to creep back in. Reality was waiting, and I knew it wouldn't be long before it demanded its due. It was raw, unrestrained, and completely consuming. The next morning I woke up in his arms, the events of the night before replaying in my mind. I knew I should feel ashamed, but instead I felt an odd sense of contentment. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged. As I got dressed and prepared breakfast for the children, Daniel walked into the kitchen, his expression soft. "Good morning," he said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We should talk," he said, his tone serious. I nodded, knowing he was right. We couldn't keep pretending this wasn't happening. We couldn't keep living in the fragile fantasy world we had built. But even as I agreed, a part of me wasn't ready to let go. The days that followed passed in a haze, each one more reckless than the last. Daniel and I were consumed by the fire we had ignited. Every stolen moment felt like a treasure, a secret I both cherished and feared. But as much as I longed for him, the guilt weighed heavier on me with each passing day. Charlotte returned from her conference the following Monday, her cheerful presence a harsh reminder of the life Daniel and I were slowly dismantling. She was warm and kind, utterly unaware of the betrayal unraveling beneath her own roof. Watching her play with Ellie and Jonah, I felt the sting of shame deep in my chest. She didn't deserve this. None of them did. One evening, after Charlotte had gone to bed, I sat on the porch steps, staring into the night. The crisp air wrapped around me, and the stars above scattered like shards of broken glass. I pulled my scarf tighter around my shoulders, as though it could shield me from the chill and the storm raging in my mind. Daniel's footsteps were soft against the wooden floor as he joined me. He sat down beside me, close enough for our shoulders to touch. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low. "I've been thinking," I replied, still gazing at the darkened sky. "About us?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "Daniel, we can't keep doing this." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "No," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "It's not just complicated. It's wrong. You have a wife, a family, and I've lost myself in this. I don't even recognize who I am anymore." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and gentle. "You're still you, Layla. You're the woman who loves my kids like they're her own. The woman who's brought life back into this house. Don't let this ruin everything." I pulled my hand away, tears burning my eyes. "But it has, Daniel, don't you see? We've ruined everything." For the first time, his composure cracked. "I love you, Layla," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you." His words sliced through me like a knife. I loved him too. There was no denying that anymore. But love wasn't enough to erase the damage we had done. "I love you too," I whispered, the admission slipping out before I could stop it. "But it's destroying me." The following week, I made a decision. I knew I couldn't stay. Not like this. The weight of our mistakes had become unbearable, and I couldn't keep living in a house built on lies. Quietly, I began searching for a new job. I reached out to agencies and families in need of a nanny, though the thought of leaving Ellie and Jonah broke my heart. I had grown attached to them, and the idea of walking away felt like ripping out a part of myself. But I knew it was the only way to save what was left of me. One evening, as I tucked Ellie into bed, she looked up at me with her wide, innocent eyes. "Layla, are you leaving?" she asked, her small voice startling me. I smoothed the blanket over her. "Why would you think that, sweetheart?" "Because you've been sad," she said simply, "and Daddy says people leave when they're sad." Her words struck me like a blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, fighting back tears. "Good night, Ellie," I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. But as I walked out of the room, I knew that her simple observation had captured the truth I had been avoiding. I was leaving because staying would destroy us all. I forced a smile and gently brushed a strand of hair from Ellie's face. I'm not going anywhere right now, sweetheart. Go to sleep, okay? She nodded and closed her eyes, but as I left the room, her words stayed with me. People leave when they're sad. She was right. I was leaving because I couldn't stay in a place that had become a prison of my own making. 2 weeks later, I handed in my resignation. Charlotte was stunned, her expression shifting between confusion and concern. "Layla, is everything okay?" she asked, setting her coffee cup down on the counter. "Yes, Mrs. Bennet," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I've been offered another position, and I think it's time for me to move on." She looked genuinely hurt. "You've been such an important part of this family. Are you sure about this?" I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm sure." Daniel didn't say much when I told him. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, sadness, regret. "I can't change your mind, can I?" he asked quietly. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I have to do this." The day I left was bittersweet. Ellie and Jonah clung to me, their tearful goodbyes breaking my heart. Charlotte hugged me tightly, thanking me for everything I had done for their family. And Daniel, he stood silently by the door, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't speak as I loaded my suitcase into the taxi, but the weight of his presence lingered with me long after the car pulled away. As the house faded into the distance, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The home that had been both my refuge and my prison was now behind me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to find myself again. I had to reconnect with the faith and values I had abandoned, and I had to forgive myself for everything that had happened. That night, in the small apartment I rented across town, I knelt on the floor and prayed for the first time in months. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered my prayers, and a sense of peace slowly washed over me. I wasn't perfect, and I had made mistakes, but I was ready to start over. Thank you for watching. If you found this story gripping and want more like it, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for jaw-dropping stories every week. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you have your own wild stories or ideas you'd like us to bring to life, drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear them.